Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan and non ideological analysis and information. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about the types of political polarization. Did you know that there are different types of political polarization? What are those different types? Why is it important to understand the different types? How do we measure them? How long has America been polarized? And which particular type of polarization is one that can, unfortunately, be exhibited by any one of us? All this and more is on tap for today's episode. But first, there is some debate as to how high the level of polarization is in America, but it is undeniably increasing in some fashion. On the TV, on the radio, the internet, even in person encounters, you'll notice an unhealthy level of toxicity as the political divides become increasingly apparent and worsen. It's permeating our political discourse and has seriously hindered our ability to have real conversations about important topics. Most people can see this, but what is understood much less is the fact that polarization is not a one dimensional concept. There are many ways to measure it because there are multiple types of polarization. And as polarization becomes progressively more relevant, so does the need to understand the ways that polarization manifests and foments. So today we are diving into the ways that polarization can be broken down, where we see these types of polarization, and why all of us need to be careful about exhibiting polarized attitudes. Because if you think that you cannot possibly be polarized in some way, and that there is no way that you could be dragged out into the political fray, I have some unfortunate news for you. But it's not all doom and gloom. I have good news too. So, here we go. First, we should talk about how long has America been polarized. We might romanticize an era where we were younger or grew up in as devoid of polarization, where most people got along. At least that polarization was not that common. The level of hostility might have been lower, but part of it is just because of your cognizance of things. When we are younger, we tend to romanticize an era with our nostalgia goggles. We tend to not see all the terrible things going on because we're just not aware of it. What was a fantastic time for us to grow up in, or for one person to grow up in, was a terrible time for somebody else. In reality, polarization in America has ebbed and flowed at different points in time. And a really great book to read on this topic. I don't necessarily agree with everything that is said in the book, but this book right here, if you can see it, it is called The Second Civil War, by Ronald Brownstein, How Extreme Partisanship Has Paralyzed Washington and Polarized America. It's a really long, extended look at the ways that polarization has ebbed and flowed, mostly in terms of partisanship. But again, great book for you to read. You should definitely go ahead and check it out. But let's just think about the fact that, for example, we've had multiple assassinations or attempts at assassinations of political figures. Sadly, we just had the other day a former Minnesota House Speaker for the state house. She and her husband were just, let's call it what it is, they were assassinated. And U.S. history has, unfortunately, plenty of those instances too. And obviously, not just U.S. history, but world history in general. Presidents that were assassinated: Abraham Lincoln, William McKinley, John F. Kennedy. We've had other presidents where there were attempts to assassinate them: Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan, FDR, some more not necessarily well known attempts, but as a president, your life is going to be threatened simply by the fact that you are the chief executive of the United States. But it's not just presidents that have been targeted. We've had plenty of other political figures too. Probably one of the more famous ones, Aaron Burr, prominent scumbag of early U.S. history, killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. We've had other major instances in earlier times in America. For example, what's referred to as Bleeding Sumner, U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner. He was viciously caned in his office by U.S. Senator Preston Brooks of South Carolina regarding an anti slavery speech that Charles Sumner had just had on the congressional floor. I forget the exact year that happened. Then in 1798, you had the Lion Griswold Brawl, a fight with a cane and fiery tongs between U.S. House Representatives Roger Griswold of Connecticut and Matthew Lyon of Vermont. They had a personal feud going on there. So polarization has reared its ugly head multiple times throughout U.S. history, even since the U.S. declared independence from Britain. Now, obviously, not necessarily in terms of assassination or actual fistfights, but the very fight for independence in America was by no means supported by all Americans. There were still a lot of Americans that were loyal to the British Crown, and then there were a lot of Americans that just didn't want to be involved. They just wanted to be left alone. Whatever happened, happened. And then after the American Revolution, the states were actually quite disunited with many conflicting interests. Really, the only thing that had united them at that point was opposition to Britain. And again, not everybody in the population supported independence from Britain. But in terms of the actual governments, really the only thing that had united them was being opposed to the British Crown and its rule over the colonies. So it really took a while to resolve those issues, and you saw the eventual shift from the Articles of Confederation to the U.S. Constitution. That was not supported by everybody either. There were a lot of people that were very vociferously in support of the Articles of Confederation, and some that were very much against the U.S. Constitution. Also, technically, the U.S. Constitution was illegal according to the text of the Articles of Confederation. The Constitutional Convention was supposed to be, at least it was under the guise of heavily revising the Articles of Confederation, not completely throwing them out and putting an entirely new document in effect. And a really great book to read about that is this one right here, The Quartet, Orchestrating the Second American Revolution, 1783 to 1789, by Joseph J. Ellis, an American historian. So definitely read up on that one as well. And then you had sectional interests, more so in terms of geography, that were more pronounced in the early days of American history. The North and the South, obviously slavery being one of the really big ones, but you also had the expanding West and their own interests that were being regarded, and again, partially about how to expand and to prevent slavery in the newer states. So this level of polarization that we see, or polarization in general, is not a new concept in American history. And it really hasn't necessarily been an upward trajectory that entire time either. Largely was, at least up until the Civil War, because that was just something that was fomenting for a long, long time, with the North and South having various spats regarding economics and slavery and various other issues too. But after the Civil War, it's been kind of like an ebb and flow, at least depending on how exactly you measure polarization, which we will, of course, get to shortly. But it's hard to argue against the idea that the height of polarization was the Civil War. I mean, we became two countries after all. Although, if you ask Abraham Lincoln, he didn't really believe that we were two countries. He just saw the southern states as in rebellion. But if we want to go back to, or at least trace the origins of today's polarization, one could argue that it can be traced back to the 1950s and 1960s. In 1950, the American Political Science Association had a report called Toward a More Responsible Two-Party System, a report on the Committee of Political Parties. And back then, the Democratic and Republican parties were, I mean, they weren't the same exact thing, obviously, but there were a lot of conservatives and liberals ideologically in both parties, especially pronounced in the Democratic Party with the civil rights movement. Southern Democrats very much not in support of the civil rights movement. Northern Democrats a lot more amenable to it. Republicans had their own schisms as well. And so the American Political Science Association was basically saying these parties need to really figure out who they are and make distinct choices for Americans to pick from. Now, they did kind of get their wish. Now there's a lot of distinction between the two parties, and some might argue that it's really gone the exact opposite way of what the American Political Science Association was complaining about. But during the 1960s and 1970s, citizens became more cognizant of the concepts of liberal and conservative ideology. Now, people have their own definitions of what those exactly are, but just thinking about those labels. Now, there's still a lot of people that, believe it or not, really don't think along those lines, but it started to become more pronounced during that time frame. And one of the really big impetuses for that was Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign, where he really made his conservative political philosophy the center of his campaign. Now, he got trounced by Lyndon B. Johnson in the overall election, but his influence on politics at large was felt for years and years to come. And we've talked about him on a couple previous episodes of the podcast. And you started to see what's called the great sorting out. Some people call it the great sorting out, where more and more conservatives move towards the Republican Party and more liberals move towards the Democratic Party. And you saw a lot of states that strongly leaned toward one party around that time slowly started going another way and becoming much more towards that side. For example, southern states, once considered the bastion of Democratic Party strength, now they're very Republican. Several northern states like Massachusetts and Vermont, once incredibly Republican, now are very Democratic. So there's been a lot of change, obviously, but at the same time, polarization has still persisted in some sort of way. So let's get to why it is important to distinguish the types of polarization. Because when you're studying anything, especially in an academic context, it's important to operationalize, which is a fancy academic term for saying define terms to know how it is being studied. And several of the reasons that is important is because other people who study the same topic can look at your data and try to replicate it more easily. If people want to agree or disagree with your findings, they'll at least know how you got to it so they can try to refute it or support it. And then when you're trying to teach people anything, we need to be on the same page as to what words mean. If people don't know what you mean by something, they're not really learning about the concept, or at least not in the way that you're trying to teach it. Because polarization is not simply a question of, is this person or group polarized? We need to know how they are and to what extent they are polarized. So there are multiple ways to study polarization, and they aren't necessarily perfect measures either. There are countless academic studies of polarization that have measured it in various ways, and some that make a point of the fact that political polarization has had a whole bunch of different ways to measure it. And some of those ways we're going to talk about in the rest of this episode. But you also got to think about sometimes the types of polarization can look indistinguishable or they overlap. For example, if I want to measure the ideology of the political parties in Congress over time, is that a measure of partisan polarization or ideological polarization? Because I'm looking at the parties in Congress, but I'm also talking about their ideology. So people can be polarized in one way, but not necessarily another way. And depending on how people are polarized, it will change the best approach toward trying to depolarize them. So, how exactly do we measure polarization? So, for this podcast, this is not necessarily a foolproof, I guess, not necessarily an entirely agreed upon, like, this is exactly how people would divide it up. But just to make things simplified and straightforward, and so we're on the same page, I'm going to talk about 4 different types of polarization. One is partisan polarization, which is polarization between political parties. Usually that's Democratic versus Republican. Obviously, they are the two major parties, but you might be surprised to find out that this can also apply to certain third parties as well. Number 2, ideological polarization, which is polarization between ideological camps, liberal versus conservative. 3, issue polarization. So polarization on specific issues, beliefs on specific issues. So we might be talking about abortion, guns, LGBTQ policies, foreign policy regarding specific countries like Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Palestine, all sorts of other places in the world. And then number 4 is affective polarization, not effective, affective with an A. That is polarization in thoughts and feelings about other people, even if they are in your party or lean towards your ideological side. Usually it's referring to people who think differently than you, but there can be certain affectively polarized attitudes towards people that are on your side as well. We'll get more into that, of course, but affective polarization at the end is one that I really want to hone in on. And for each type of polarization, I'm going to go into more detail about what they are and what they look like, followed by some of the ways that we can study it and ways that it has been studied before. Because you could be polarized in one of these ways, but not in others. Maybe you have a strong partisan affiliation. Maybe you are a lifelong Democrat or a lifelong Republican, but maybe you're not ideologically polarized, or vice versa. Maybe you're a very strong conservative or liberal, but you do not like the party that you would normally be allied to because you don't think that they're far enough to the side. Maybe you think the Republican Party is not to the right enough. Maybe you think the Democratic Party is not to the left enough. So polarization can vary along those kinds of lines and also various other lines too, like, for example, political participation levels. If you're more politically active, you tend to be more polarized. You're not necessarily more polarized, but you tend to be because you tend to have a more vested interest in what happens. You tend to see politics as a sport, as an existential crisis. Political polarization can also vary along the lines of elites versus non elites. Elites being government officials. So, government officials tend to be more polarized than citizens are. And polarization can also vary along geographical lines, that is to say, national versus state context, because there's varying degrees of polarization across states, and some are more polarized than the national context. There are some very Democratic states, there are some very Republican states. First type of polarization to talk about today, partisan polarization. That refers to the level of polarization between political parties. And of course, that usually refers to the Democratic and Republican parties because they are the most prominent ones. But this can also apply to some third parties as well. Some may criticize Democrats and Republicans as being too extreme to one way or another, but some third party members think the two main parties are not extreme enough. But instead of going completely independent of any party, they may find a third party that is far to their side. Couple of examples there. I'll use one for both the left and one for the right. The Green Party, generally very left leaning, particularly focused on environmental issues, but a lot of times they don't think the Democratic Party is liberal enough. And so they go to the Green Party. And then you have on the right side, you have the Constitution Party, generally very right leaning and particularly focused on states' rights. They don't think the Republican Party is conservative enough in a lot of cases. But of course, just to be clear, not every third party is far to one side or another. There is, for example, the Libertarian Party, which is the most common third party you see. Now, a lot of the prominent libertarians that people see, they tend to be allied with or vote Republican. So some people may assume that libertarians are actually just more to the right, but that's not necessarily the case. Libertarians tend to be economically conservative, but socially liberal. And depending on how strongly they feel about each of those kinds of issues, they might typically lean towards the Republican Party or they might lean towards the Democratic Party. Maybe they care more about the social issues that they're liberal on, so they might vote Democratic. Maybe they care more about the economic issues that they're conservative on, so they might vote Republican. Really just depends on which libertarian you talk to. Now, of course, a lot of these libertarians probably Some of them prefer to vote for a libertarian candidate, but there's not always a libertarian candidate to vote for. So they might just have to vote for their party that they typically would align with if they weren't libertarian. Essentially, the more strongly someone identifies with a party label, the more partisanly polarized they are. They tend to support that party in everything. They tend to make excuses for the behavior of that party if it's in some way benefiting them. So, what are some of the ways that we can measure partisan polarization? One way you could do that is by studying party platforms. This is more qualitative and less quantitative. Qualitative meaning you're studying more of the qualities, the descriptions of something, as opposed to quantitative, which is more numerical. If you're studying party platforms, it's kind of hard to put numbers on things because you're looking at specific words and you're using these descriptions of platforms. But that is a way to do that. If you look at the Republican Party platform nationally versus the Democratic Party platform nationally, you can study it that way. There are both pros and cons, benefits and drawbacks to studying things in a qualitative fashion versus a quantitative fashion. It really just depends on what exactly it is you're studying. Personally, I think having both is very beneficial, but sometimes you can't have both. But in any case, you can look at it from a national context, the national platforms, the state parties sometimes have their own platforms as well. Again, some variation in how polarized parties are in each state. Some Democratic parties may be less liberal. Some Republican parties may be less conservative. Really depends on the context you're looking at. Second way to study partisan polarization is you can look at straight ticket voting, which basically describes how much voters just vote for the same party across offices, because obviously there's a lot of officials that you got to vote for. Might be presidents, might be governor, might be U.S. Senate, U.S. House, State Senate, local. There's a lot of things to vote on, and some places have more things to vote on and more people to vote on than other places do. So, how much do geographical units vote for members of the same party across these offices? So, we can look at it in terms of states and whether they vote for the same party. So, maybe does the state vote for the same party for president and for U.S. Senate, or if it's one of those states where they only have one U.S. House rep, which means it's a statewide race, and then governor, attorney general, if that's an office that that state votes on. Not every state votes on their attorney general. I'm talking about the state level attorney general, not the federal attorney general, because that's appointed by the president. So you can look at it through states, you can look at it in congressional districts, you can look at it in terms of counties, you can look at precincts. Precincts are voting subunits to show wherever somebody lives, it dictates what exact precinct they're in. So you can look at it very, very minutely, very granularly that way, or you can look at it through towns and cities as well. You have to use these units, though, because you can't look at individual voters and how they voted. So you have to work with these groups. I can't go to a voting machine and see, okay, this exact person, how did they vote? Okay, but you don't know who exactly that person is. You'd have to have them tell you that they split ticket vote or that they straight ticket voted. You're not necessarily going to get the answer from them depending on whether they think, oh, I don't know if I should tell people that I straight ticket vote. But some states allow you to actually fill out a simple option that says, I want all Democratic candidates or I want all Republican candidates. And I'm going to tell you right now, obviously, I don't put any sort of opinions on specific parties or individuals or ideological groups or anything like that. And I try to keep all my other opinions out as much as possible. But I'm going to say right now, I think having an option to just lazily put, I want all candidates of this party, I think that's ridiculous. You should have to fill out every single one of those bubbles yourself if you really want to do that. I think that's just lazy and really adds to polarization. But that's beside the point. So could also, again, just poll people on whether they straight ticket voted, but they might not want to say they straight ticket voted because they may perceive that as socially undesirable. And sometimes people will change their responses on polls if they think somebody's going to look down on them, even if they are anonymous polls. The third way that you can study partisan polarization is by polling on whether people find meaningful differences between the parties. Earlier mentioned how people became more cognizant of the terms of conservative and liberal starting in the 1960s, maybe even arguably in the 1950s, but especially in the 1960s. And we've had several polls since then, probably more than several, that have included questions basically asking people, do you think there are more important differences, or excuse me, do you think there are important differences between the parties? And trends have shown people increasingly agreeing with that statement. It was much lower during the 60s and 70s, but it started going up 80s, 90s, more recent decades. And then a fourth way that you can study partisan polarization is that you study party in government, party in organization, and party in electorate. Now, what does that mean? These terms describe studies of party in terms of how they operate in elected office, which is party in government. Party in organization is the campaigning arms of the parties slash interest groups, and party in electorate is the voters. So, how partisan polarization looks can and often does differ within those three. Now, there is some debate as to whether partisan polarization is looking more and more similar across all three of those, but still, levels of party polarization differ to some extent within those three spheres. Now, those are not the only ways to study partisan polarization, but they are examples. Now, let's move on to ideological polarization. This refers to the level of polarization between ideological camps, between liberal and conservative. Do not fall for the trap of conflating party and ideology. A former professor of mine from grad school, Dr. Craig, would be beside himself if I didn't make that clear, or at least if people listening to this made that error in judgment. Yes, the parties tend to be ideologically one way or the other. Democrats tend to be more liberal. Republicans tend to be more conservative, and that's been increasingly the case since Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign in 1964. But ideology and party are two different dimensions. I can tell you from reading polls myself that there are still liberals in the Republican Party. There are conservatives in the Democratic Party. It's partially depending on how people define those terms of conservative and liberal. Because if I asked five different people what liberal meant and five different people what conservative meant, I could very well get five different answers. And again, some people don't really think in ideological terms, anyways. And there's also differing levels of conservatism and liberalism within the respective quote unquote correct parties. So some Republicans are somewhat conservative, some of them are very conservative. Some Democrats are somewhat liberal, some of them are very liberal. And some people identify with either the Democratic or Republican parties for reasons other than their general ideology. Maybe they vote that way simply because their parents voted that way and they don't think much more beyond that. Well, my daddy and my mommy, they voted for Democratic Party, they voted for the Republican Party, so I do too. So it's sort of like almost an inherited trait that they got from their parents to just keep voting that way. And so it might take a lot more time for that opinion to change. But in any case, people have varying reasons for voting Democrat, varying reasons for voting Republican. So it might not be about the ideology. But in essence, the more strongly someone identifies with an ideological label, the more ideologically polarized they are. So, what are some ways that we can measure ideological polarization? Well, one way we can do it is by polling differences in economic and social ideologies. You can be economically conservative, but socially liberal, or vice versa. Whenever you just generally depends on what exactly you're studying, but in some cases, it's not very helpful to just ask, are you conservative or are you liberal? unless it's like a very specific situation that you're talking about. But when you're talking about people's general ideologies, yeah, there are still plenty of people that are both economically and socially conservative, and there are a lot of people that are economically and socially liberal. But it usually helps to make a distinction in that regard. And a lot of studies do, and a lot of studies say the same thing of not looking at conservatism and liberalism as a one-dimensional left to right spectrum. You look at it through two dimensions or even more dimensions than that. Another way you can study ideological polarization is by pulling self-identification in ideological views. So this is often depicted as a 7-point scale, 1 being very liberal, 2 being liberal, 3 being somewhat liberal, 4 being moderate, 5 being somewhat conservative, 6 being conservative, 7 being very conservative. Some, like the Gallup poll, just generally trying to get an idea of how many people or the percentage of Americans that are conservative, liberal, or moderate. They might just simply ask, "Are you conservative or are you liberal?" And over time, there has become a little bit. The percentage of people saying that they're moderate has gone up a little bit, depending on polling that you're looking at. Sometimes you see a little bit of an uptick in conservative, but it partially depends on where exactly you go get that information. Another way that you can do it is by doing it on a strong, somewhat neutral, somewhat strong spectrum. Basically, strongly liberal, moderate, somewhat conservative, strongly conservative. You can also do it on a 0 to 100 scale. And these all have their own benefits and drawbacks too. 0 to 100, some people might not necessarily think that granularly. And if you ask them on one day, they might say, "Oh, I'm 60." And then another day, they might say that they're 63. And is there a meaningful difference between the two? But you can get a lot more detail that way as opposed to a 7-point or a 5-point scale. A third way that you can study ideological polarization is by pulling how much people believe their party should be uniformly ideological. You often hear both Democrats and Republicans lament that some of their fellow Democrats or Republicans are quote unquote not true Democrats or Republicans. Is that no true Scotsman fallacy? And so you might hear the term Dino, which is Democrat in name only, or more commonly, you might hear Rhino, which is Republican in name only. The question of how much they think their correct quote unquote party should be in ideological lockstep can also differ. So somebody may be very strongly liberal, very strongly conservative, but they don't necessarily think about the fact that their party should be the exact same way as well. Some people do, and they will let you know they think that, but obviously not everybody's going to feel that way. A fourth way that you can study ideological polarization is by looking at the ideology of elites versus the ideology of voters. And I want to highlight a specific study from long ago in that regard. It was Philip Converse and his seminal work, The Nature of Belief Systems in Mass Publics, all the way back from 1964. The study that he did indicated that there's a lot of difference in the sophistication of belief systems of government officials versus the public. Basically, elites' belief systems are more rigid and tied together, while citizens are much more fluid and far less abstract. For government officials, being conservative, being liberal is a core part of their identity, and they have to have their issue beliefs in line with that conservative or liberal belief system. And if one issue belief changes, that tends to change beliefs in the rest of the system because they're so interconnected. For citizens, there's a lot less of that. If they change their belief on one issue, they're not necessarily going to change their belief on another issue. And they don't necessarily think in terms of ideology. They may think simply in terms of, has the party in power benefited a social group I belong to? Is my wallet doing well while this party is in power? The ideology may not even cross their mind. One instance that you see this kind of thing in is in retrospective voting, which is simply people voting according to whether they think the party in power has done a good job or not. And if they think they haven't, then they're just going to vote against them. If they think they've done a good job, they're going to vote for them. A fifth way that you can study ideological polarization is through VoteView's DW Nominate scores. VoteView is a data repository on how members of Congress have voted on bills and nominations and so on, specifically just taking into account what has come up for a vote and giving it a sort of, is this a liberal way to vote on it or is this a conservative way to vote on it? And so they have this measurement called DW Nominate, which spatially represents members of Congress's ideology purely on how they voted, not how they identified themselves. Because due to what bills and nominations and so on are voted on, it can actually make somebody appear more or less liberal or conservative than they say they are. And it's just because of what's come up. So there's actually an article they wrote. I don't know how much it's relevant to them now, but you talk about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, very progressive, very liberal members of Congress. But according to these DW Nominate scores, at least early on, they appeared to not be that liberal. But that was partially because of simply what was coming up for a vote. So it didn't really let them show how liberal they were, at least to some extent. And just like any other measurement that you want to use, it has its pros and cons. So it's in some ways useful to know how liberal or conservative they were based on what exactly was up for a vote. But sometimes you want to know how conservative or liberal they are on things that theoretically could come up for a vote too, especially if you're a voter who cares about that kind of thing. And so, and these scores go all the way back to the first Congress for every party that has ever elected a member to Congress, even some very esoteric third parties that have long since come and gone. There's a DW Nominate score for them. In fact, let me show you right here the actual parties overview that they have here. This is Congress at a glance, major party ideology, Federalist Party when they still existed, then later on when they were replaced by the Whig Party, and then when the Whig Party became replaced by the Republican Party. And then so you have also the Democratic Republican Party, which later became the Jacksonians, and then became the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party has actually been around since the very beginning of the nation, technically. Republicans have only been around since the 1850s, but you see all these median ideology scores here. That's largely because of what bills and nominations were up for a vote at that point. And then you've got the congressional medians as well. And they also do things by the chamber, by geography, but you also have these third parties here as well, like readjusters, National Greenbacker Party, Prohibitionist, Union Labor, all sorts of things like that. So that's just another way that you can measure ideological polarization. You'd see it by how far the gap is here between the two major parties here and where the congressional median score for their ideology is here as well. Third type of polarization to talk about here, issue polarization. So this refers to the level of polarization on a particular issue. And this can look a lot like ideological polarization because there are often a lot of times a liberal view on an issue and then a conservative view on an issue. But that is more for overall ideological views, not just on one specific issue. And these can be anything from the most pressing issues that the most people care about to more esoteric issues that maybe you're not even aware of. But even though a lot of political issues have a Republican or Democratic view or a conservative or liberal view, some political issues are not necessarily partisan or ideological in nature. For example, in a lot of ballot measure campaigns, you may see some odd pairings of government officials or candidates or interest groups that would otherwise not work together on anything. But how strongly they feel about that ballot measure, whether it's for or against, can indicate a measure of issue polarization. Broad policy issues are always much more nuanced than those with vested interests in them would have you believe. Now, you might still wholeheartedly support or oppose some issue while still acknowledging those nuances, not saying that that's not the case or that it's inherently wrong. But when you have a very strong opinion on a specific issue and you tend to lean very strongly one way or another, you tend to disregard the nuances and the little nooks and crannies of the issue. And you can be polarized on one or multiple issues, but not on others. Maybe you feel very strongly about guns or abortion, but you don't really care about what's going on in the Middle East or in Europe or Russia. One example that you tend to see a lot of issue polarization on is the single issue voter. These are voters who choose a candidate purely based on their views on one issue, and they do not care about anything else, or at least they might be like, I kind of want to know what they have to say about that, but whatever that candidate has to say about one issue, any other issues they have, almost definitely not going to change that single issue voter's opinion. Maybe they just care about marijuana, and who cares about what's going on with anything else? So these voters tend to be issue polarized. They might not care about party, they might not care about ideology, so they're not partisanly or ideologically polarized, but they are polarized on that specific issue. Maybe not any other issue, but that specific issue, they have a hardcore belief on that. But maybe they don't have a hardcore belief. Maybe they are a little bit middle of the road, but that's still the only issue they care about. But generally speaking, if you're a single issue voter, you tend to think very strongly one way or another on that issue. And in essence, the more strongly someone supports or opposes an issue, the more issue polarized they are, at least for that issue. So, what are some of the ways that we can measure issue polarization? Well, one way is you can poll how much people agree or disagree with statements on a political issue. If you want to simply ask, do you support abortion? And then you can depict this in several ways that we've talked about before: the 0 to 100 scale, the strong, somewhat neutral, somewhat strong oppose or support, strongly oppose it, somewhat oppose it, neutral on it, somewhat support it, strongly support it. Couple of different ways there. A second way that you can study it is by the support of nuances on a political issue. And there's been plenty of studies on this in the past. Another study in particular I'm thinking of, and I can't remember the exact name of it, but it was polling abortion attitudes, and a grad school professor of mine, the one actually who I talked about, would be beside himself if I didn't specifically note the difference between ideology and party. Dr. Stephen Craig, shout out. He was part of a study that actually might have been a couple studies that looked into abortion attitudes, and it took several specific situations. And I can't remember the exact situations, but when you're studying the supportive nuances on a political issue, you take that one issue and break it down into specific situations and contexts, and whether citizens support or oppose those contexts. Because some people may generally say they support abortion or that they oppose abortion, but if you take specific context, now they start thinking, oh, actually, I don't know if I support it in this context or I oppose it in this context. So if we want to use abortion, if you take the context of the life and health of the mother, or the life specifically if their life is in danger, or maybe their life's not in danger, but they could have a severe health issue for the rest of their life. Do you support or oppose abortion there? What if the baby has birth defects? What is the economic status of the mother? Whether the baby was conceived through incest, all sorts of different contexts to think about. Doesn't mean that you necessarily can't oppose or support it in all those contexts, but it's just you might get different views on it when you start to break it down further. Or talk about owning guns. What if it's an automatic? What if it's a semi-automatic? What about getting larger magazines for more bullets? What about bump stocks, which basically lessen the recoil of the weapon so that you can fire more shots off? Whether 18-year-olds should be able to buy it or they have to be 21. Do they need background checks? all sorts of context to think about as to whether people support or oppose guns. And then a third way that you can study issue polarization is by studying how much one party or one ideology aligns on a particular issue. Now, this can look like partisan or ideological polarization, which it is to some extent, but it's focused on a specific issue. So you're thinking of how much do Democrats support or oppose this issue? How much do Republicans support or oppose this issue? And you'd ask the same question of conservative or liberal and see how much those ideological and partisan camps diverge on this issue. Again, not the only ways that you can study it, but some of the more prominent ways too. And then the fourth type of polarization to look at, affective polarization, which refers to the feelings and attitudes that we have toward other people, particularly those with differing political views. Note, this is affective with an A, not effective with an E. Most notably, this is the kind of polarization that contributes to the hatred we see today. And it doesn't have to be explicit hatred of other partisan, ideological, or issue groups. This can also be fear, disgust, distrust. If it's relating to your emotions, it's probably relevant to affective polarization because that translates to your feelings and attitudes about different groups of people or specific people. And so essentially, the more strongly and viscerally someone reacts emotionally to someone or something, the more affectively polarized they are. How do they feel about the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, conservatives, liberals, independents, moderates, specific issues? Yes, obviously, those also relate to partisan and ideological and issue polarization. But when you're talking about how they actually feel about those kinds of things, that becomes affective polarization as well. So, what are some of the ways that we can measure affective polarization? One way, simple polls of feelings about people of different parties and ideological views, more so if a lot of people exhibit strongly or extremely positive or negative opinions about an individual group or entity. So maybe they have like well, I'm not a huge fan of the Republican Party. I'm not a huge fan of the Democratic Party, but I don't hate them. But then you have people that are like, I hate the Republican Party. I hate the Democratic Party. Maybe they hate both of them. That still is a measure of polarization, at least affectively, especially if these feelings are couched in partisan or ideological bias. For example, if you look at approval ratings of a sitting president and you look at it in terms of, well, how much do Republicans approve of this president? Obviously, Donald Trump in this case. How much do Democrats approve of the president in that case? A lot of it is both partisan and affective polarization. Democrats, not only are they tend to oppose Trump, they tend to strongly dislike, if not hate him. Republicans, not only do they support him, they tend to praise him. Matter of partisan and affective polarization. Or if you looked at conservatives versus liberals, similar results, but again, party and ideology, not the same thing. A second way that you can measure affective polarization is looking at the errors in perceptions of the membership of other parties and the ideological extremity of social groups. So, research has demonstrated this many times in the past, where if you take, let's say, a Republican and you ask them how ideologically extreme they think Democrats are. Or if you take a Democrat and ask them how ideologically extreme do you think Republicans are, they tend to think that the other side is more extreme than they actually are. And a lot of times they also tend to think that their side is less extreme than they actually are. Or people tend to overestimate the membership of social groups in a party. Maybe a Republican overestimates the number of black voters in the Democratic Party. Maybe the Democratic Party overestimates the number of Protestant Christians in the Republican Party. Because of your affective polarization, you tend to think, there's probably a lot of those other people that are in that party that I tend to disagree with. Maybe not necessarily hating of those other social groups, but it's still couched in some sort of negative attitude or feeling that you have about that party. Another way you can study affective polarization is by studying the respect for political institutions, not just the membership of those institutions, but the institutions themselves. So, how do people feel about the presidency? Not just if it's Donald Trump there or Joe Biden there, presidency itself. What about Congress as a whole? Congress routinely very, very low in approval rating. U.S. Supreme Court has experienced a lot of recent struggles in perception in that regard. So, not just the people in these entities, the entities in themselves. And fourth way to study affective polarization, I'm going to highlight a specific poll. And it was not one that was actually trying to measure affective polarization specifically, but some of the findings they have indicate a level of affective polarization. Georgetown University, I believe it's every year, they have a poll detailing general thoughts and feelings people have in regards to politics, not necessarily who they support, but general thoughts and feelings about what's going on. And several findings indicate a an incredibly unhealthy level of affective polarization. One example, the poll in 2023 found 7 in 10 voters believed that their personal values were under attack. And that was a vast majority of Republicans, but it was also sizable majorities of Democrats and independents. You think your personal values are under attack, you're generally going to have a very negative opinion of other people because you think they're trying to attack the core of who you are, that it's an existential threat. And another way that that poll indicated affective polarization was people's perception of the level of political division, the average rating they had there. And it was a 0 to 100 point scale. And in that year, the average rating was 72.9 out of 100. 100 meaning you feel that the country's on the verge of civil war. So 72.9 is disturbingly high in that regard, thinking that, boy, this level of political division is about to really spill over. And then the poll also asked their perception or their prediction of the level of political division 1 year later, and it was actually up. It went from 72.9 out of 100 to what they thought the level of political division was to 73.65 of what they thought it was going to be 1 year later. So they are thinking their personal values are under attack. The very nature of who they are was under attack, and also just the general level of political discord was astronomically high, which goes into the biggest point I want to make here, and it's why affective polarization is particularly insidious and can in fact, can also affect anyone, including me. And it's something I've got to make sure I watch out for. Some people are partisanly polarized. Some are ideologically polarized. Some are issue polarized. Some people are a combination of the three. They might be partisanly and ideologically polarized, for example. And these can be problematic, but I don't want to say that people are inherently wrong by being largely one way or another. I'm trying to be impartial here. That's not really the problem, at least not by themselves. Being polarized along these lines still doesn't inherently mean you act in a toxic manner to others. Somebody can be very conservative, very liberal, very Republican, very Democrat, and still get along with a lot of different people that don't think like them. But anybody of any partisan, ideological, or issue group can be affectively polarized. Not just extreme Democrats or Republicans, not just extreme liberals and conservatives, independents and moderates can be just as susceptible to affective polarization because we're talking about emotions here. We're talking about thoughts and feelings towards other people, especially people who don't tend to agree with you on politics. For example, some studies have found many independents, not all, but many independents are motivated by their distaste or even hatred of the party they typically vote against, or both major parties. And hate is a very powerful motivator for bringing people to the polls, especially those politically active people, because they tend to see things as an existential crisis. And moderates can be hateful of conservatives and liberals too. So we may all want to think that we're above polarization. Well, I talked about it at the very beginning. We can all believe that we're above the political fray, and it's nice to think that way. Some people actually revel in the fact that they're in the mud and dirt of politics. Some people don't like that, or at least say they don't like that, and they think that they're above it. But the problem is, when it comes to affective polarization, any one of us can fall into those traps. Because the real issue is when we become affectively polarized. What are some of the things that can lead to? It can lead us to treat politics as an existential crisis, as a sport. I'm a big sports fan too. Sometimes I am very biased against certain other teams or certain other fan bases. I try to, as much as possible, not to feel that way in politics, but it's a very easy thing to do to get very angry at somebody or some group or something when you have strong political beliefs. Another reason that the issue of affective polarization is the biggest issue when it comes to polarization is we think everyone's out to get us. So in turn, we are out to get them. And we justify that. We say, well, I'm going to get them before I get got. I'm going to make sure that I'm protecting my beliefs and my people that I tend to agree with. And I'm going to stop these other people from trying to get me. You go back to that Georgetown University poll where how many people thought their personal values were under attack. Another issue with affective polarization is that it can feed into and reinforce the other types of polarization, and that there is no way that they can start budging. Again, there's nothing inherently wrong with where you are on the party spectrum or the ideological spectrum or the issue spectrum. The issue comes from how you feel about people who have different opinions, or the fact that you won't ever budge from your opinion because you think you have everything figured out, which is unfortunately a very big problem in politics. People who think that their worldview explains everything, even though it doesn't. Another effect of affective polarization is it can lead to the suppression of other opinions, and then you justify it along various grounds. Oh, that stuff that other people are saying, that's hateful, it's dangerous, it's unpatriotic. It's not just that you just tune them out, that you just sit in your silo, your echo chamber, but you might actively start suppressing that opinion. How many times have we seen a political view that in the minority that feels like it's being oppressed, that it's not getting its time to say anything, that it's lambasting the majority party, majority power, and how it tries to squash minority opinion, and then when that minority opinion becomes the one in power, they start to suppress other people's opinion. It's a tale as old as time, long before the US even became an entity. Another effect is that there's a reinforcement of echo chambers that are already prevalent in media, especially with these social media algorithms that just reinforce these attitudes. There's a litany of TV, radio, social media channels that will cater to your specific views and make you feel all warm and fuzzy because you found somebody else that agrees with what you believe. Because we all want to find people that agree with what we believe, and so that we can have conversations with them. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's when that becomes the only group that you go to for information and to talk about, to not have any sort of challenge to your worldviews. And another issue to highlight that comes from affective polarization is it leads to people being more willing to justify and support the use of violence against, even outright murdering, opposition. We just saw it. Well, it was actually just today or yesterday for this recording, but by the time this comes out, it'll be several days ago. We just saw a former Minnesota State House Speaker and her husband were just assassinated. Or you on the Democrats, that's on the Democratic side. Republican side, Donald Trump was the target of an assassination on the campaign trail last year. It's becoming a very disturbing trend how much that's becoming an answer for some people. And not only that, some people even justifying that or making an excuse. Maybe they're saying, I don't condone murder, but this person said that's not the point. The point is that violence in this regard is never, ever the answer. You can't just beat people up because you disagree with them. You certainly can't kill them because you don't agree with them. And you have social media and media in general is just making this such a commonplace thing. And even if they're not outright saying to be violent towards somebody else, they are basically, they are still riling you up and trying to get your emotions heightened. And then you do start to become more, if not approving, at least justifying of that kind of attitude, of that kind of action. And that's not something that we should ever, ever be okay with. Now, not everybody who exhibits some level of affective polarization will do all these things. Again, may only lead you to do something as simple as just constantly yell at people on Facebook and Twitter as if that's going to solve anything. You may routinely ignore any opinions that are not your own. You may not actually try to suppress them, but you may just tune them out. But these are still issues that can lead to being susceptible to what your echo chambers tell you to do and what they tell you to think. You should never, ever get to a point where you're just closing off, shutting off any sort of other opinions. It makes you a lot more easily manipulated because it's easy to get mad and be afraid of something, to hate something or somebody, to be disgusted with them, to have knee-jerk reactions. They're very human emotions, and some points in time, those are okay emotions to have. Some things should make us mad. Some things should be disgusting. We should hate certain things. We should be afraid of certain things. But this affective of polarization, which is where we get exceptionally angry and exceptionally afraid and disgusted and distrusting of our fellow Americans, of our fellow human beings. Affective polarization is what is ultimately preventing us from achieving real, long-lasting solutions to our biggest issues. And also, funny enough, a lot of affectively polarized people, they don't think they're the problem, but that it's everybody else that needs to shape up. That Georgetown University poll, one of their other findings was that basically large majorities of people found while they supported the idea of compromise, they thought their side had compromised enough, and it's the other side that needs to give a little bit more ground. Although, funny enough, they also did get asked later on. They said, okay, maybe we can give up a little bit more ground. So there's been some mixed signals from people to some extent in that Georgetown University poll. But it's a problem when you think that you are not susceptible to any sort of manipulative ploy. Unfortunately, with how human nature is and how our brains work, anybody can be manipulated. I can certainly be manipulated. I certainly not something I want to ever think is possible, but it can be. And I don't support any of these really any hateful acts or any violent acts, but there are still ways that I can be affectively polarized. Any one of us can be affectively polarized, even if we don't ever ultimately support drastic measures like murder or at least beating the crap out of somebody. You can still completely shut people off and go to your echo chambers, which still foments this affective polarization that other people are particularly susceptible to and start taking drastic measures because of. And there's a lot of social grifters, especially out in social media, that want to capitalize on affective polarization because our emotions make us ripe for manipulation. And these people know it, and they do it not just for political gain, but for monetary gain. You get a lot more clicks on your news articles and your YouTube channel by being loud and obnoxious and insightful. Not insightful as in, oh, this person's got really great things to say, as in they incite people. And it just becomes this vicious cycle that self perpetuates these affectively polarized attitudes and actions. So I don't want to just leave it, of course, on all that doom and gloom, because there are ways that we can really check our propensity for affective polarization at the door. How do we check ourselves so that we aren't so affectively polarized? I will, as much as I don't like to self promote, I've mentioned it at the end of each episode, my educational email course about how we make mistakes when trying to depolarize the political climate that actually can make it more polarized, and why we make those mistakes and how we can correct those mistakes. So that those are some ways, and I want to point you out to that. I don't want to give it all away here, but some other ways that we can be cognizant of our propensity for affective polarization and how we can make sure we at least lessen how much we act in that kind of manner. To be actively cognizant of your own biases. Everybody's got them. Doesn't matter what your party affiliation is, or if you even have a party affiliation. Doesn't matter your ideological affiliation, or if you even care about ideology, or what you think about issues. Everybody's got a bias because everybody's a human. Everybody has human nature affecting their thoughts and feelings and actions. How do those biases affect the kind of information you seek or let in? You think about, you know what? Maybe I am starting to really create this echo chamber. Maybe I am kind of getting this whole I know everything kind of attitude. Maybe I do need to really start looking for other information that conflicts with my worldview, or at least not so actively just look for just the things that agree with me. Another way is to expand your social and media circles with people of different backgrounds and views. Because not only is social media becoming more siloed, but in real life, we're becoming more siloed too, people are severing friendships purely because differences of political opinion, and not over things that are like the justification of violence kind of thing. Some people are just simply like, oh, that person's a conservative. Oh, that person's a liberal. I'm not going to have anything to do with them. We can't do that. So expand your social and media circles so you have more of those kinds of people, because we're all on the same team here. Another way to try to prevent affective polarization from affecting you is you reevaluate your opinions of other people and be willing to update your views. Every one of us can easily get upset at something or somebody, and even if we don't remember the exact reason that we were upset at them, we remember that we were upset at them. So be willing to try to think about, okay, well, why did they think that way? Maybe they came across as a jerk, but they weren't actually trying to be. There's been times where I've had an opinion about somebody that I thought was, and I'm just talking about in personal life, not necessarily specifically in politics, although I've had a few of those too, where I encounter somebody and I think, oh, you know what? Actually, maybe I had this person wrong. I've had people that have done that to me as well too, and sometimes, sometimes it is their fault, sometimes it's my fault. It, it could be all sorts of reasons that you had that previous opinion about somebody. Be willing, or something, be willing to reevaluate it when you have more information. Another way to prevent affective polarization, or at least hinder affective polarization from getting you, is you recognize how your emotions can be manipulated for somebody else's gain. I had not too long ago, several episodes ago, a bit about clickbait and rage bait and how effective it is and why it's so effective, because we have a propensity to let our emotions get the best of us when we see something that makes us mad. And it's not just these videos, these rage bait and clickbait videos, they're not just for the people that agree with them. Sometimes the people that disagree with those videos, they still engage with it. They still share that content and say, look how stupid and terrible this is. You're playing into these social grifters' game. You are circulating that content. Even if you're not actually explicitly sharing it, you looked at it, you commented on it. Even if you didn't click on the video, you lingered on it and thought, oh, that thing really makes me mad. Oh, I want to click on it. Don't do it. you're playing into their game. Ignore it. Unless it's something so that absolutely needs to be addressed. And even then, that can oftentimes be detrimental. Like if there's something saying something racist or sexist, just report it. Don't engage with it because it's still circulating it. Report it if there's a way to report it, because that way you, at least theoretically, hopefully, if it is actually racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever, that content will actually be cut off before it really gets to reach a lot of people. And it's getting harder and harder to stop that kind of hateful content, unfortunately. But just don't let your emotions be manipulated to the point where you actually engage with that content in a way that helps that content fester and circulate. And then lastly, and this shouldn't really be something you have to say, and I think most people do get this, but never, ever, ever condone hate or violence. It's all right to get mad. It's all right, or at least in some cases, it's all right to get mad. It's all right to be disgusted or to just have a visceral reaction. I mean, that's normal. We cannot get to a point where we are outright hating somebody and wanting violence to happen to them and being okay with that violence because of differences in political views. We cannot have this. We cannot have what happened in Minnesota happen again, or what has happened to countless Democrats, Republicans, independents, third parties, people being attacked, if not murdered, for their views. We cannot have that happen in this country. And hopefully, we're going to be able to stem that tide at some point. But it's going to have to take a lot of reevaluation from all of us and how we engage with political content. And so hopefully we will be able to fix these kinds of things. And I do have faith that we can fix these issues. But again, does not mean you can't be angry at anything or anyone, that we can't hold people accountable, because people do need to be held accountable. But a lot of times we mistake accountability with simply being, I don't like what this person said. If you're only attacking people that are not on your side, and I'm not talking about physically attacking them, I mean verbally attacking them. That is not accountability. That is just getting mad at somebody for being different than you. We can't keep doing this. This is not healthy for anybody, and we're not going to solve our biggest issues by continuing this behavior. So hopefully those tips there that I gave are a good beginning point for for all of us to really step outside ourselves and really look at how we're engaging with politics. So I'm going to end it there. As always, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Please like, comment, subscribe, share the podcast with anybody you know, especially people that you think could especially use a talk about polarization. Although obviously you got to be careful with how you approach those kinds of people. You can't tell, hey, you're an idiot and you need to watch this. That's not going to help. But please like, comment, share, and subscribe for the podcast. It's on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. My links in the show notes, like my Facebook, my LinkedIn, my educational email course that I just talked about some of the ways that we accidentally make polarization worse and why we make those mistakes and how we could do better and fix those mistakes, and believe that's it. So I'm going to end things off here. Once again, as always, thank you so much. And let's all come together a little bit more and really try to listen to each other a little bit more and not be so quick to anger. But anyways, talk to you next time. Take care.